So glad you are all with us. Jose is going to get us started with a word of prayer and a small devotion, and then Chief Rielage, I will introduce him, and we'll get started with today's training.
All right. Thanks a lot, Nancy, for having me. And also thank you for everyone for joining us today. It's a great day where we're having Mr. Robert join us to teach us about some great stuff. As we continue today, we're going to say a short prayer and then just about a 3-minute devotion. And let's get started. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we say thank you for this day. Thank you for gathering us in such a great time. We ask you that you grant us peace and also a clarity of mind, even as Mr. Robert takes us through the lessons of today. And we ask you for a clear connection in the internet, and also a reminder to all first responders to log in. We pray all this trusting and believing in Jesus' name. Amen. So today it's an interesting day because as I was preparing for the devotion, for the 3-minute devotion, I was asking God, what is the good lesson for us to learn today? And God actually took me to this devotion that I removed from this book that Chaplain Craig Duck presented to us. It's on day 2, and it says God's path to safety. Yeah, and today mostly what I believe we're going to learn about safety on the fire ground and also decision making. God also has a path to safety. Yeah. And it takes us to this verse in the Bible in Psalms chapter 16, verse 1. In the NIV, it says, "Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge." You see, I remember myself, I'm a volunteer firefighter with the Nairobi Fire Brigade here in Mathare. And I remember one time on the fire ground, Nairobi Fire Brigade had already responded. And immediately when I went on the fire scene, I had to identify myself to the battalion chief of that time. And I asked him to give me a role. The role he gave me on that time was, "Hey, Jose, could you please just do a scene size up?" So I had to check the scene, go around the house, the big houses that were getting burnt. And also 2 things I had to check. What is an egress plan, just in case the firefighters needed to get out, which is the best way for them to get out. And number 2, how safe can I stay when I'm on the fire ground? So even as the Bible says in Psalms chapter 16, verse 1, "Keep me safe, my God, in you I take refuge." Even when you're on the fire ground, what refuge are you seeking when, for example, you're in danger, and also when you need to protect your firefighters? The competent firefighter observes a structure prior to entering, and while inside, he continually strives to be aware of his location and the availability paths of escape. When you're in the fire ground, make sure that even as you're fighting fire, make sure that you know when everything gets really bad, how do you get out? Yeah, that's actually safety for yourself and also safety for the guy who's giving you, what do we call it, a backup, you know? So that's a devotion for today. Always know that even as you're on the fire ground and you're facing a lot of trouble, not only on the fire scene, even when you're in the firehouse, maybe you're having home issues or you're having station issues and they're not being addressed, you can always find a path to God and always ask him, "Hey God, how do I deal with this? How do I deal with this in such a way that I don't disrespect my superior, and also I stay healthy in mind and keeping a safe ground?" Thank you for that. And that's how we're going to be doing it. Just 2 minutes, 3 minutes devotion, and as we move ahead. So back to you.
Excellent.
Nancy.
Thank you, Jose, for that word of encouragement this morning. I'd like to introduce Chief Bob Rielage, retired Chief Bob Rielage. And Chief Rielage was a part of Africa Fire Mission's trip as we were working in Nairobi only in 2014. So he was there at some of the very early trainings that Africa Fire Mission did. And we're so excited to have him with us today. He's going to be talking today with us about fire scene awareness and preparing you to have increased awareness on the fire scene. So Chief, I'm going to pass that to you.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate that. First off, Jose, very excellent prayer, and also your devotional almost became my introduction from that standpoint, as you'll see in just a second. So again, I thank you for that, and it'll be it hopefully will be very informative for everyone. Good afternoon, first off, to everyone. What I'm going to try and do today is a little bit about fire scene awareness and talk about some of the tools that will help make firefighters safer. First is obviously the fire scene awareness overall, but we're going to talk a little bit about what's called the OODA Loop, and we'll discuss that in detail and how it works for the fire service. We basically have 4 principal things that the OODA Loop does. The first is observe, which is to gather information prior to arrival, even pre-planning, and the initial extent of the fire, assuming it's in a building or if it might be, an outdoor fire or whatever. We orient ourselves. That is, just as Jose was saying, we walk around. We do a 360, or at least one of the command officers does, and we gather information from all sides, and we notify the fire crews that are operating if there's any dangerous conditions that might be there. We decide, that is, we'll select a strategy, and really there's only 2 strategies, but there's sort of a third that's in between that we've sandwiched in. Offensive, go into the building, put out the fire. Defensive, stay outside, and we try to extinguish it with the water that we have. Or transitional, which is something that we're beginning in the United States quite clearly to do, and that is, if we get there and there is fire showing from an outside, we hit it. It's as they say in New York, we hit it hard from the yard, which means basically we knock the fire down from the exterior and then go inside and put it out. And there's all sorts of science now that basically tells it's not only safer for the firefighters, but it's actually safer for the people inside that may be trapped or not able to rescue themselves. We then, after we decide what we're going to do, we obviously have to act, and that's the OODA, the 2 O's, the D, and the A. But then it's also a loop in that we continually gather the information, and we look at the progress that is there, which basically is information which helps not only the progress on the fire, but the safety of the fire crews that are there. And finally, the OODA Loop is a way for us to decide if we need to change our tactics. If it's not getting better after a certain period of time, and experience is one of the greatest things that we have as firefighters, if it's not darkening down, if it's not getting better from the situation, if we're not able to get past some obstacles, then it's time to change. And again, through the OODA Loop process, to come up with something different to do and act on. Go ahead, Nancy. Okay. The OODA Loop actually encourages decision makers to think critically, and that's important. It also anticipates threats. What is out on the fire scene that could cause some problems with, with firefighter safety, and then to overcome them before it's critical. For example, looking at the building construction, seeing if there's any possibility of a collapse. Those are the kinds of things that walk around, that decision making in the early stages, or I should say the process in the early stages before the decision maker decides what the tactics will be. That is where it becomes critical and why the OODA loop comes into play. Now we'll go to the next. Okay, just put this up because Colonel John Boyd, who was a pilot in the United States Air Force way back in the 1950s, developed the OODA loop. And he developed the OODA loop because the difference between aircraft in the Second World War, which were fast, but then by the time jets came along in full use in the 1950s, there was less reaction time that the pilots had to make decisions as to how to overcome the threat of what the enemy planes were. So the OODA loop was developed by Boyd. He also worked well into the 70s in the US space program. So again, just an informational background as to where we get the OODA loop. Go ahead. Okay, so developed in the 1950s to help combat pilots with critical thinking decisions. A process that once learned can help shorten the time that we have in making a decision. If you follow that, the steps are obvious. You don't get frozen on any one step, so you come pretty quickly to what your decision is and how you're going to act. It's designed as a loop, as I mentioned, because it's a continuous situation to look to see if the change is better. And we all know that in a fire, that can be in just a heartbeat away, that something different takes place that causes us to have to rethink how we're approaching that fire. Again, it's adopted by the fire service because of the information that we obtain throughout the operations at the fire ground. We begin early and we continue throughout the fire or emergency incident well until it's extinguished, and after we've done all our other things, including the fire investigation, to making sure that everyone on the fire scene is safe. Okay, this is how it was designed by Colonel Boyd. As you can see, it is a loop, and it's observe, orient, decide, and act, and continues on around in a circle continuously. And so that's the process that we have. The first step is in the OODA loop is to observe. And I want to say that it's the main purpose here to focus, to build a comprehensive mental picture of a situation as accurate as possible. But it's also not just as you approach the fire scene. There are some things that we'll talk about which, for special fire situations, you may want to go out, for example, at a high rise and look at that building beforehand and observe what is going to be your potential hazards. What are going to be the things that you're going to have to overcome to fight that? Or again, you might want to pre-plan something that is a hazardous material area or a manufacturing concern that you have. You might look at special things like life hazards that are the schools that are in the area. So basically, getting out and looking is part of the OODA loop ahead of time. But then it's how has that changed, because you're familiar somewhat with that building or that occupancy. How has it changed now that the fire has occurred? Go ahead. Okay, so observe, again, I talked about pre-plan, and I've used here, if you might all look at, is the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. As we all know, within the last 2 years, that suffered a critical fire. So pre-plan those critical sites, decide how you would fight it. Probably very important from my experiences, as far as in Kenya is concerned, is determine if there's access to other water supplies. I know in a lot of, it's a long distance between where the fire is and water. And we'll talk about how that even affects us here in the United States. So observing really begins with looking at those critical infrastructure places, those critical buildings, and deciding beforehand how you're going to do it. Okay, next slide. Here's the OODA Loop for Observe. This is a picture that was taken right as the first fire companies in Paris arrived. Remember, they had a delayed alarm. They had a situation where they had a fire alarm system in the cathedral, but that wasn't immediately notifying the fire department. And the initial person mistook what the real smoke detector going off was. It was going off in the attic space above the roof, and they thought it was going off into one of the early chapels. That delayed until they actually saw smoke, someone calling the Paris Fire Brigade, and basically this is what they observed as they were pulling up. Go ahead. So then the thing is Orient. Colonel Boyd referred to this by a German term called Schwerpunkt, which basically translates to the main emphasis. What are we seeing in context that we recognize the barriers that might interfere with other parts of the process? In the case of Notre Dame, obviously the fire was in the roof. Obviously it was above even where their highest aerial pieces could get to. So the only thing that they had in that was initially to try and carry hose up initially about 6 flights of steps and try and fight a fire in what we would look at as a roof space or an attic space, well involved when they got there. So we try to orient what is our best way? What is our water supply that's there? That's the orient part. Go ahead. Again, orient, and this is after the fact, but this is how you would have to look at it. And if you look closely, you'll see some red vehicles that are still around after it was extinguished. I'm sorry? Okay. But if you look from this, there are, Notre Dame was actually sitting on an island in the middle of the Seine River. And so basically they had water, but limited amount of water to fight this fire, even though it was one of the magnificent structures of the city of Paris. And then they wound up bringing their 2 fireboats up to either side and pumping out of the river. And that was something that wasn't done initially. They were trying to fight it conventionally, but having that as an option in orienting how you're going to decide to fight this is one of the things that we needed to look at. Go ahead. Okay, now we come to the decide. It's no surprise to us that after we've observed and we've oriented ourselves and we've gathered the information, including going around that structure and seeing what other obstructions there might be, we describe the step as really, if you know from science, what's a hypothesis? What's the best way that this might work? And then the implication is that we decide, but we really test to make sure that we might be having some flaws or other things that future observation may tell us that there's a better way. Obviously, in this particular case in Notre Dame, they started to fight the fire pretty much standardly, you know, trying to find a water source, which is their fire hydrants in Paris, you know, which had a limited water amount of source, and go inside and try and fight it. They soon found that that was overwhelming. And while the fire crews came back to where the 2 towers were in the front, they stayed inside, but they went to an aggressive exterior attack at some point. So the initial decision was good at the moment for what they thought, but as the fire progressed and their observations changed, they went back and changed their tactics. So decide is there, and the 4th step, if you would, here we go, is decide and then act. With a decision made, now you have to act upon it. You have to see how good the decision has been. Did you observe the right information? Is there something that's changed? Did we use the best possible mental fire model? Did they look at it from hopefully having the first arriving companies know and be familiar with every aspect of that cathedral. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I don't know that for sure. But whatever the outcome is, we now cycle back to the first loop, which is observing. Are we making progress? We look for critical changes over a reasonable time. Is there a change in the color of the smoke, perhaps, that means that we've got water on the fire? Does it mean that we're actually extinguishing? If not, it might be time for a plan B. And in the case of the Notre Dame, that was moving the firefighters out of the attic space of the roof and back to a safer spot. So acting is the fourth step in the OODA loop. And in this particular case, they had their hands full. They had to look at other things that were going on from that standpoint. Go ahead. Next slide, Nancy. There we go. So using the OODA loop, how can the fire service use that? Well, the information gathered, as we mentioned, before arrival, plus, we go back one. Okay. What information we have from dispatch? What kind of call was received that notified you as the firefighters of what type of fire it is? How many fire units are coming with you? I know that that's very limited in some cases to the number of firefighters that are on duty, depending on what's there. And the information gathered on the scene, and we'll show you a little bit from other fires, how we can even look at that prior to our arrival. Obviously, for every fire, and Jose mentioned this, an initial size up of the extent of the fire by walking around and getting a good handle on it. And in some cases, buildings might be so large you have to drive around to see what the extent of the fire is. But the 360 observation, looking for hazards that could hurt the firefighters. For example, is there look like there's going to be a building collapse, which in Notre Dame, they were very successful in not having a building collapse. But if you remember, there were times when, as the news media was reporting all this, that they were seeing cracks in the towers. They were seeing things that looked like the whole entire roof structure was going to collapse into the cathedral itself, which never did. The firefighters did an excellent job. And then any hindrances that we're having. Obviously, water was a problem there. Obviously, not having high enough aerial devices were a hindrance as far as that was concerned. Go ahead. All right. So how does the OODA loop help us with our strategy? What are our strategies that we would use in the fire service? An offensive would be an aggressive interior fire attack, which is what was started by that first company. And I must tell you, they did an excellent job in what they had from what they were there. Finally had to be relieved and pulled back. Is it defensive? Does that mean that we get out our largest caliber nozzles and we fight it from the outside because the conditions that are there, including structural collapse, are just too dangerous for a firefighter to be working inside on it? Do we do transitional? And transitional is something new in our thinking in the United States, and that is because of wanting to take care of things quickly, especially to get people outside in either a dwelling or a multifamily or a high rise, is that we do an initial exterior attack on a vented fire. And by a vented fire, I mean that where there's fire showing out the windows or there's something from there that we can knock down, and then we switch to a very quickly aggressive interior attack for extinguishment. Sometimes that takes a crew to do the outside work and a crew to do the inside work, and the coordination is part of the OODA loop for the officer in charge to be able to know when it's time to shut down the exterior and go in and hit the fire from the interior, because you don't want those two to happen at the same time. That's why it's called transitional. Go ahead. Okay. Tactics include, and this is all the thing that goes into the OODA loop to get to tactics: securing a water supply, if possible, If not, knowing what you carry on the engine that has arrived and how it should be used. Search and rescue for potential rescue. Rescue mode means that maybe you have to just protect the firefighters that are going in perhaps above the fire to, in a stairwell to get the victims out. That's a different situation if you know that that building is occupied and you know that there are people there. Again, part of the OODA Loop process. Choosing a correct size of fire hose line to overcome the fire. Remember, it's to overcome the fire. It's not necessarily to conserve the water that you carry on your engine. I know that you carry, I guess, in liters around, and I'll ask that question and somebody can answer it for me either now or later. About 2,200 liters, I believe, is what was carried on the Nairobi engines. I'm not sure as far as the amount of water. That would roughly be 1,000 gallons of water the way we would do it in either the United Kingdom or in the United States. So knowing sometimes that you still flow with a larger nozzle because you have to overcome the amount of heat and fire that is there and not just conserve the water basically because that's all you have. Sometimes you got to punch it hard and get the fire out and under control with what you have on your engine. Again, something to be thinking about in the OODA Loop beforehand. Placing the fire line in the right location, i.e. protecting victims and extinguishing the fire is the best. And ventilating the fire after there's water on the fire. The thing that we've learned most recently in the United States from a group called Underwriters Laboratory is that if you vent the fire before you've got water on the fire, you're actually allowing the fire to grow hotter faster. And so consequently, the only time you would break a window, open a roof, do something of this nature, if it hasn't self-vented, is then venting the fire to get the gas and smoke out. If the fire's already vented, then it's a different situation. You either can hit it with a transitional attack through the window and knock down the fire and then go in, and you're still actually not causing the fire to spread. But a key element here as far as strategy is concerned. Go ahead. Examples of determining the strategy and tactics of the OODA Loop. We talked about observing, gathering information first, orienting, what are the strong points and potential hazards from the 360-degree size up that you're taking, deciding how best you know or suspect is the way to put out the fire by making a decision. Acting is better than not acting at all, trust me. And then taking action to carry out your decision, but setting goals in your mind, that mental picture, how you're going to show improvement. And then you begin to reevaluate based on the progress, such as achieving a goal, such as perhaps maybe getting everyone out of the building, having a plan B ready if there's no progress. That may be pulling the firefighters out and hitting it from the exterior if it's needed to be, changing those tactics. Go ahead, Nancy. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go through a series of fire pictures from here in the United States and talk a little bit about it. This is about 3 kilometers or 1 mile away from where the fire is, and a picture taken by a chief officer on their way to what they know is going to be a working fire because of the information that they got over the telephone and through the dispatcher that a relatively large manufacturing concern was on fire. So this is what that chief saw out the window of their car before he got to the fire. Go ahead. This is what it looked like when they arrived. Small office part in the front, a large manufacturing in the rear. The fire already having done a lot of structural collapse. And I should say to you that this was about 2 hours after the plant had shut down for the evening. And what the plant was a tire manufacturing location where they actually made industrial and farming type tires that were so thick that they couldn't be punctured if they go over a rock or something of this nature. So this was a very, very specialized manufacturing concern. The chief and the key members, officers of the department had only about 3 months beforehand during their annual tour gone through this and seen what the manufacturing process was like, and were very, very familiar with the building. Now, that's how it looked in the beginning, and the 360 observation. What the 360 observation reminded the fire chief of is, and you can't only, oh, you go to the next one, Nancy, it's fine, is a little bit on the left side, you might begin to see just past those trees what looks like a little bit of a depression and a water. And that was part of a creek that flew into a bigger river that also was where all of these folks got their drinking water from. So the chief, in looking at this, basically is looking at, if I put water on this fire and it flows into that creek, and I know that this process has very, very caustic chemicals, those that would cause us to get sick, am I going to do more harm than good? And that chief's decision was, go to the next slide. That chief's decision was, in full awareness that it meant a total loss to this manufacturing plant, he decided that he had to let it burn. So this is what it looked like the next morning. The office part had a firewall, and basically they were able to keep the fire contained from the office records. But the building itself was on the ground, because he looked at it and said, there's already been a structural collapse. There were 2 other walls that were weakened, and he didn't want to place firefighters into those positions. And the third thing was, if he put a large amount of water on the fire, he had the potential of contaminating the drinking water, not only for his community and his city, but for many cities around that got their water from the larger water source that basically that creek drained into. So that was part of the OODA Loop, making a decision that's really, really difficult. And as you can see, the next morning, there's the construction equipment, which was going to go in and help tear out some of the areas so that basically they could just do a limited amount, and they actually had people there that were monitoring a very limited amount of water just in a very contained area to put out the spot fires. So in essence, that fire was allowed to burn itself out. And we'll do a comparison to another manufacturing place in a second. Go ahead, Nancy. All right, what do you see here? This is something that I really don't know. When I've been in Kenya, it's never snowed where I was, but this is snow on the ground. And if you see and you look, it's a bus, a transportation bus that has caught fire. Now, it looks like it's just a bus fire. So the question is, what did you see? We go to the next slide. This is taken out the window of the chief's car. And what is over here on the right is a gas station. And what is close on the other side that you can't see is a truck that was bus caught fire. And rightly so, the driver abandoned the truck. So basically, you've got an exposure. You've got a huge amount of potential for having not only this bus catch fire, but having an explosion or having that truck, catch fire as well. So again, that 360 observation, even in this particular case where the chief just drove around, is important, because if you just get to the point where it's like the candle moth, where the moth goes to the flame and nobody else takes a look, you might not see these potential hazards that are there for the firefighters. So this is a very, very important situation to note. If you go back and look at the first picture, you think you've got a bus fire. If you look at this, and obviously you can see there was a strong wind that night, it was blowing it directly towards the gas station. Go ahead. All right. These are residential fires. And actually, these are a couple fires that I have been to and helped as in this particular case, the safety officer. If you look at the left and you see the smoke coming out, this is what the first arriving engine company saw when they arrived. And it looks like a one-story house that's on fire. And from this vantage point, you probably think, okay, this is maybe you know, a bedroom fire perhaps, or you know, a kitchen fire at worst. You know, but doing the 360-degree observation, you can see that the officer realized that the fire was really in the basement, and that the smoke alone was coming up and making it look like the fire was on the first floor. It was also the fact that they had this house that was sort of built into a hill, and it looked like a one-story house from the front. It was a two-story house in the rear because it overlooked some woods and you know, a very nice scenery. That fire officer elected to come with the hose you can see and attack the fire directly. And it had vented through that window where you see the smoke. It had vented, and he went into the basement area and actually turned out to be an electrical fire that was in the basement, and they put out the fire, and then you know, were able to stop it from spreading into the first floor. Now, the other thing that's there is, if you're not doing that 360-degree observation, and you had sent the people through the front door and they said, oh, this is a basement fire, I'm going to go down the steps. There's two things that have happened in the jurisdiction where I work now. Number one is we've had floors collapse because you don't know how long that fire has been, and if it took out the stability of the floor, it could fall into the basement, into the fire. And we actually had 2 firefighters perish about 12 years ago on such a fire. And number two is that, you know, you're causing them to go down where there's high heat, where they could just walk around to find an entry into that basement that is only going to give them the heat that is on the same floor, and not the chimney effect of all that heat coming up the stairwell as they're trying to go down. So different levels, and it reveals what there might be in the way of hazards. That's all a part of the OODA Loop and part of the Observe and Orient. The Orient part of that was that officer decided that it was going to take that line to the back of the house, and then his tactic was he was going to go in and he was going to extinguish it. So again, part of the OODA Loop. Go ahead. By comparison, this is one that was in a neighboring. They arrived on the scene with this picture showing, and it looks like it's a very, very, very large structure, a house, maybe a fire in the rear. What's there? What actually turned out to be was this was a good, oh, maybe 100 feet away from the actual residence, but it was an industrial agricultural storage building. But because of the way they looked, and this building sat about 500 feet or more off the road, they thought they had a large fire in the structure, where in essence, when they started to get back there, they realized that this was where their agricultural storage was. Much different. They didn't go inside to try and fight that fire. You can see that the roof is gone, and they fought it and extinguished it from the exterior. Again, what you see needs to be done with that observation. Go ahead. Like the one fire that we talked to you about, that, and then again, this is another one that I was at. This is a smaller house that was under renovation, and basically decided that this was an exterior attack. And there were two reasons for that. Number one is, you can see it a little bit on the picture on the right, but the roof was already to the point where the roof was going to collapse, and it did in the rear of the structure. If there had been firefighters inside, that would have caused them probably some serious injury. It also eventually had a wall collapse where the line on the right, the large caliber line was set up. So even though this was in some ways a fire that, you know, someone would normally have said, well, we'll go through the front door and we'll extinguish that fire, the officer in charge doing the 360 saw that the roof had collapsed in the rear, in the rear of the structure, and saw that the side wall was weakened, and said, rightly so, this is an exterior attack. Even though it's a single family dwelling, even though it's a small structure, we're not going to put firefighters in danger by doing that. So sometimes it's just too dangerous to do it. Go ahead. Again, what can we learn from the OODA loop and the observe, orient, decide, and act? And again, it's continuous process as we go around and we look at the OODA loop. Go ahead, Nance. All right, plan ahead. We visit the major hazard sites that we have in our area. We make a pre-plan, if we can, that includes discussing possible strategies and tactics based on those observations. And we practice that through training. I can't tell you, and I haven't talked to anyone in Paris for a long time. Right before I had been to Paris sometime before the fire in Notre Dame, and we had talked about some of the beautiful things that they have that they're trying to protect, the museums, you know, the churches, and not just Notre Dame, but there are beautiful churches and places of worship in Paris that are just unbelievable. And we had talked a little bit in my talks with some of the folks in the Paris Fire Brigade, the pompiers, that basically, you know, how do they approach that? And I truly believe they had planned ahead. They had just not planned ahead with that late of an introduction into the fire, because that automatic fire alarm system had been misread, and someone said it's a false alarm, don't call the fire department. That's the bottom line of what happened with that fire in Paris. But if we plan ahead, if we look at those, if we discuss how we're going to fight those kinds of fires, and we save a lot of firefighters, and we're going to extinguish a lot more fire. Go ahead. All right, this is sort of the last observation that I have. This again was in the jurisdiction that I serve in, but this was right at Christmas time, and I was on vacation. This is what the chief officer that was on the scene saw as they were coming. Look at the amount of smoke, and the reason it's white is because in our area around Christmas time, it's around 20 degrees or less Fahrenheit, and so that's even, you know, a number in Celsius, even, you know, below 32. So basically, this is what they saw. Go ahead. This is what it looked like on the front of the building. And you can see that it's a well-involved manufacturing building process. And we'll show you an overhead shot in a second. Go ahead. This is what it looked like in the rear of the structure. And you'll note that while the building is well involved, there are actually 5 separate structures in this concern. And the reason that it was built that way was so that it could be contained. And the reason that we'll see that we contained it, although burning down that one building because of it being so far in advance, the other 4 buildings were saved. And there's a huge lesson to be learned from that. Go ahead. All right, this is it again from the front of the building. The one building, obviously completely destroyed. It was a defensive attack. That we knew it was going to be a defensive attack. It saved all but the original building of origin. And, you know, yes, this is going to be a huge loss to this manufacturing concern, but basically was what we had told you know, when we had there, if there was an advanced state in this building, this is how we're going to fight it. We're going to protect the other structures, and this is what we did. There's a couple things that I want to show you, especially from the overhead shot. Go ahead, Nance, next shot. There are actually 3 separate water supplies, and we'll show you the third one in there. But we knew that we had water from 2 separate types of water sources, and we tapped into each of them because individually, if we would have just kept on the one water supply, there wouldn't have been enough to contain it. As you can see, this is earlier on in the fire than the last shot, but you can see that we protected the other 2 structures, and obviously the other ones were far enough away from having the fire spread. And there were 2 separate water sources that we had gotten into to get enough water on the front of the building. But if you start to notice that big road that's behind it, you'll see some fire equipment that's on there. Go ahead to the next slide, Nance, and I'll try and blow that one. This is what blows it up. All right, there's these pieces of the apparatus on the back, and what we had there is very similar to some of the operations that you have when you have limited water supply. We were shuttling in water from tankers and from other engines to put out the fire in the rear of the building. Again, part of that pre-plan. Now, we shut down a major highway to do that, literally. But we knew that if we had a fire in that building, that was the reason why we had to do it. Otherwise, we would have lost a whole lot of more of this manufacturing concern. And the last slide, or I think either the second last or the last. Okay, we're not there. Okay. This is what that person, after suffering a $2.1 million fire loss in the one building, put up on the fence in front of the building because they had rubbed it off so nobody could get in and hurt themselves. That building with the thank you sign for saving the rest to build through the other parts, the other 4 buildings, there was a total of $15 million worth of manufacturing and storage equipment that was in there. They thought it was an excellent job, even though this was a total loss. Why? Because this building had been pre-planned. It had been done during the way that was trained to do, and basically no firefighters were hurt in this fire, even though it was such a huge fire on a very, very, very cold day. I'm sure that's the last slide, but go ahead and just see if it's, yeah. The OODA Loop, another tool that can be used by professional firefighters, well-trained, just like you. And that's the reason why we've gone through this today with regard to our training. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have.
I have a question.
Go ahead,
Good.
James.
Or maybe it's an opinion. I was just wondering, in terms of pre-site visiting, could it be mandatory that most of the buildings that are being constructed or put up within a municipality should deposit maybe a floor plan with the fire department to make it easy, just in case if they get a call, they can refer so that when they are going to the scene, they have a certain picture of where they're heading to?
Absolutely. And let me go with 2 things that most departments do. We have both some of those floor plans on the computers that we have, but we also carry them in a book. And the reason for that is that fire can happen during a blackout or something of this nature that knocks out a computer. So we always have on paper what the floor plans or what the key elements of those, especially industrial or high risk for occupancy plans, so that we know exactly where things are. if by chance the building is sprinklered, and none of those pictures that I showed you were in buildings that had a sprinkler system, but we would also show where we can support that sprinkler system by putting water into it. Does that help you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That was insightful.
Okay, hi.
It's good to see you.
Yes, thanks. Mine, it was just another question, it's just also to come up about the debate. The issue of having a plan in the municipality or in the county. Some of the county, if it is in the bill, you know, if you want to building a house, it has to be also approved by the fire officers. But in some other county, we are not implement them. So it's just going to the building section in the, maybe in the, so that they can approve without passing to the fire station. But if we are working together, I think so it's a very a good time as per this topic of today, that we are forcing in our bill or in our procedure, in the policy, that if whoever building a house, it has also to pass to the fire station for making approval. That I think so will be in a picture. In case of any fire in the building, you will know how the structure look like. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, and you know, that is something that sometimes in the fire service you have that opportunity to do, and in some countries you don't have, you know, that. It is important. The more information that you can gather prior to having a response, you know, to that building or to that residence, just gives you a better plan, and more of the, you know, observing that you know, that you need to formulate through the OODA Loop to have an action step that is the best both for the residents and for the firefighters. It just makes sense. So the more that you can pre-plan through, you know, looking at building plans and making suggestions, you know, in some cases, if it's a large structure, you may ask them to put in something like a cistern close to it where it gathers rainwater that you can pump out of. Those are all things that, you know, that help make, you know, the occupancy safer, both for those people that are in it and for those firefighters that are responding to it. Absolutely.
Thank you, Chief Rielage, for
My pleasure.
everything today. I'm seeing applause. You guys can use your little reactions to give them a round of applause. In the chat, I was getting some private messages. Very, very much appreciated for the training today. So thank you very much. Big thumbs up.
And just stay safe, folks. We're good.
We're so grateful for all of you attending, and those of you who've been every week. We're so glad to have you back every week. Thanks, Chief Rielage, for participating with us today.
My pleasure, and thank you all for putting up with me for an hour. Thanks.